Okay, the session for the next 90 minutes, or 3 o'clock, will be what we're calling a fishbowl. And so the idea is that you will be looking in on a grant review process. Now, this is a little bit different than many of us have taken grant writing courses, and we've seen the videos from NIH, or we've seen the videos from NIH on grant reviews, or we've seen mock grant reviews. This is a little bit different than that, because the focus here, remember, the focus of the conference is on building rigor. So the theme here is building rigor. So the question is, how do you build rigor through the whole review process? So the way that this will go is Dr. Persch has graciously agreed to put his work out there, not only to reviewers, but to an audience of 150 to 200 people, which is pretty crazy. So kudos to him for being willing to do that, because that's very hard to do. So he's going to talk for about 10 minutes about the grant that he wrote, the mechanism, and sort of what drove him to write the grant. Then we have 30 minutes where reviewers 1, 2, and 3 will critique their grant, using the same NIH guidelines as those of us who review the NIH review guidelines. After that, Dr. Persch will come back and give a response to the reviewers, and then there'll be about a 20-minute interaction with the reviewers, and then about 10-minute or 20-minute interaction with the audience. So you see what's going to happen here is he's being reviewed, and then in real time, he is going to respond to the reviewers and interact with them. So the idea is that through that interaction, he will have heard what other peers from different backgrounds, what they view as the sort of the weaknesses in his grant, and he will attempt to correct it in some way, shape, or form without, as my response is to reviewers. My response to reviewers is not always the optimal one, and that would be crying. So hopefully we'll go beyond that. Just a note to the reviewers, I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves real quick when you go to give the reviews, okay, rather than me doing that right now. All right, so I'm going to turn this over to Andy Persch.
Thank you, Michelle. And so I'm grateful for this opportunity. I do want to recognize Susan Magacy, who was doing this, I think, about 40 years ago. And so when I was sitting in the audience, I benefited from that process. And so her courage a few years ago gives me the courage to stand here today. So a few disclosures before I get into the grant. My research program is supported in a lot of different ways. I have a working spouse who's very supportive. That has to be first. This work was part of my PhD, and that was supported in a number of different ways. In my first 4 years as faculty at Ohio State, they provided substantial both startup and protected time for me to focus on this work. And then this work has been funded previously in part via 2 mechanisms. One is a U.S. Department of Education grant, students with intellectual disabilities, specifically pursuing post-secondary education. And then recently a contract with a county board of developmental disabilities to translate this tool into Spanish to meet the needs of their local population. I also have done consulting with Jessica Granger this year. So those are my disclosures. I also want to frame this with a timeline. So just so you can have a little bit of context and try to understand my trajectory and how I came to this point. Bachelor's and Master's of OT at Wisconsin-Milwaukee in 05 and 07, PhD at Ohio State in 2014. This R01 was originally submitted in October of 16, then resubmitted in March of 18. As I made a change of institution that required a transfer application this past year. That was a new process for me, and I'm happy to share that the grant is funded.
Yay! Woo!
All right, so now I'm going to try to hook you and get you all excited about transition to adulthood employment in the population of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so we're gonna talk about vocational fit. And so we're gonna try to communicate this idea in a playful theme that you can touch base with. Okay, so my ultimate goal as a researcher is to help improve employment outcomes for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. That's the end game, and I'm interested in all the different ways that we can, that we may be able to do that. If you don't know, I'll share with you there are approximately 8 million Americans living with intellectual disabilities. And in the years immediately following the transition out of high school, we observed that approximately 39% of youth and young adults with intellectual disabilities are employed in those years immediately following high school. But that's not the case over the lifespan. So if we look at the life course trajectory of employment for this population, we see that only approximately 15% of adults with intellectual disabilities are maintaining employment over time. And so that means we have quite a sizable group here that is experiencing underemployment, unemployment, despite all of the services that we are providing. Now, why do we care so much about paid employment? Well, this is a core area of occupation, and it's strongly associated with better self-efficacy, health, quality of life. There are lots of barriers. Those barriers include a lack of assessments, interventions, and services. And this language comes right from NIH. A lack of those tools that are individualized, employment focused, and real world. And so the status quo is that we're limited in our ability to make data-based, informed decisions about which potential jobs or vocational training opportunities would be the best fit for a person with an intellectual disability. And so we tend to throw spaghetti at the wall and see how they do in one job or another. And she was not prepared for that job. And so we think that a more systematic method, a valuable and reliable tool that can inform both services and predict employment problems can help us move the needle on employment outcomes for people with intellectual disabilities. So we've developed the vocational fit assessment. And there are two versions. The vocational fit assessment job is used to assess real jobs in your local community. So not a prototypical or stereotypical job, but the real job at the business that you know, and it's a real opportunity for that person. There's also a vocational fit assessment worker that we use to look at the specific interests and particularly abilities of that person with an intellectual disability. And so just to frame this in our conceptual models of occupational therapy, this really is just person, environment, occupation, where we have the vocational fit assessment person or worker, and then vocational fit assessment job for the environment and occupation. So when we're using this tool, we're asking questions like, to what degree does the worker demonstrate the ability to clean work areas? And then we're rating those items on a 3-point Likert scale, high, some, or low. Now, if a person with an intellectual disability is a good self-reporter, we absolutely want to facilitate their self-report. They may need some help, and so an occupational therapist or special ed teacher could also be doing, helping to complete that assessment. So our tool is about 100 items, and as we've gone through those 100 items, we're creating a profile of our worker. We have areas of strength, we have areas of need, and there are areas for intervention. And again, think of that as the person in PEO. Now we'll look at the vocational fit assessment job. Again, this is focused now on environment and occupation. We ask the same questions, but in just a little bit different way. To what degree does the job demand the ability to maintain good hygiene, deal with change, clean work areas? Sometimes a job task isn't relevant to a particular context. For example, if we're looking at a job in a clerical setting, those food service skills aren't all that important. And so we have employers, job supervisors, managers, OTs, special ed teachers. Anyone can complete this assessment of the job if you know enough about it. And we create a profile of the job. The next part of the tool is to compare those data. Let's quantify and visualize the PEO overlap. And so in areas where the job has a high demand and a high ability, those are our areas of strength. Where we see the job has a high demand and a low ability, those are areas of weakness or need. And we're going to need to do something in order to help that worker be successful on the job. So this overlap, right, it's the overlap of the PEO model, is occupational performance. And we're also conceptualizing that overlap as someone's vocational fit, right? They're fit for the job. It reflects their strengths, their needs, and where we can intervene. So we can compare that person to one job, and then another, and start to make decisions based on data, as opposed to the spaghetti at the wall approach. We can look at one person across many different jobs, identify a best fit. Now our tool will not tell you which job to select, but the data helps make us make an informed decision. So the princess now has a nice base of strengths, and we need to intervene, our areas for intervention. And VocaFit can help with that as well. So where there are areas of high demand, and this person had low or some ability, we can teach those skills. We can build skills, we can do on-the-job accommodations or modify the environment. We turn those areas of need or intervention into areas of strength, and the occupational performance vocational fit is improved. So now when the princess clocks in, she has the right tools to do the job. She's a better fit for that job. And it comes with socioeconomic benefits and health benefits as well. Okay, so to focus in on the grant now. Taking a step back. Right? Back at the start of the game, let's start putting in grant applications. And so I'm taking you back to my PhD, it's 2012, and we're submitting a NIDER grant that we're calling Telehealth Job Coaching. And it was not funded. A year later, systematic job matching. No. Loan repayment programs, no. And so this is one of the messages. It's becoming comfortable with failure and having the courage to get back up, because this happens a lot. And it's something that you need to and so the number here, total unfunded grant applications, I think it's important for you to see that. So these are not all my grants. I'm not the PI at all, but I contributed to them. And so that experience and all of that feedback and sitting next to other people that are smarter than me is helped what shaped my own program of research. You know, there are also a ton of things that I thought about starting and then decided against. So when we counted, I think 17 grant applications that we probably at least had one meeting about, but then decided against. So game over or not? Absolutely not. So we're turning on feedback mode now. And so this is about how you take that feedback you got and integrate it into your grant to make it better. And so you'll recall, That first grant I submitted didn't do so well, and so I get some very specific feedback. There's not sufficient justification for why this approach is superior to other existing approaches or assessment systems. And so you take that and we need to decide what we can do with it. And so in our response to the reviewers, we said we have revised the significance to include a detailed justification for why this approach is superior to the existing approaches and assessment systems specifically tabled. And so we made that change, and now we need to try it again. Okay, and the reviewers like that change. Similarly, it's not clear how some of the proposed analyses will inform the ultimate goals of this research. Again, we respond. Table 2 shows the alignment of the specific aims, objectives, methods of data analysis, and the anticipated outcomes. The relevant measurement properties should clarify how some of the proposed analyses will inform the ultimate goals of the research. It's also important to triangulate the feedback, right? Integrate what you get from one grant into another and see how it goes. All right. So I came here to Charleston for Tiger in 2016, and I had submitted stuff and I really hadn't done all that well in terms of competitive scores. So I came to Tiger and I met with folks, and then my next grant was a Neidler field initiated project. And so that score that I got, 75.9, is not great. It's not even close to getting funded. I'll tell you, there's a really low outlier that disturbs me still, right? The low outlier scores from Neidler. But again, you take that feedback, you decide what you need to integrate or not, and you'll see that the same project 1 year later has a marked increase, and we were really, we were only just 1 point off the funding that year. So, I will quickly orient you to this grant specifically. The funding opportunity announcement is PAR 18039. And you see here that we have a team coming together, because that is absolutely a critical piece of this. And my team members, many of them are in the room. Some of them are not able to be here today, but I'll mention it quickly. So this is the funding opportunity announcement. So this comes from NICHD directly. For years, scientists have sought to alleviate the debilitating cognitive and behavioral and comorbid medical symptoms associated with IED. It has become evident that there's a gap in the ability to effectively translate mechanistic discoveries into targeted therapies for humans. One major obstacle is a lack of generally accepted endpoints to assess improvement in function. And so we took this language and we built it right into the grant. And so a couple examples. First are around endpoints, where the criterion measures have failed to provide informative endpoints of employment status. We propose that the DFA provides accurate person-centered measures of work-related adaptive behavior. And so we use that language and we help to make the grant strong. Next, by targeting employment status and ultimate outcome at the ICF level of participation, we have sought to alleviate some of these challenges. And then in this context, we have a physical ability subscale. In this context, the physical ability subscale could provide outcomes data that inform targeted, clinically useful employment, support interventions, and therapies for humans. It's also very important that we align this work with what NIH was looking for. And so in the FOA, they say specifically that the outcome measures that they're looking for need to demonstrate these properties. And so we get together as a team and we take those properties and we use them to backwards design the whole study. We need to demonstrate these properties. And so what research objectives and then what methods am I going to use to go and then demonstrate these properties? And so I'll orient you now quickly just to our three aims. So aim one is to quantify VFA reliability and validity in the context of people with intellectual disabilities in transition to employment. Primary hypotheses are that the VFA will demonstrate excellent test-retest, inter-rater reliability, and then construct validity. And so just some quick fun animations to think about these different contexts. Right? The same rater by themselves, multiple raters, and looking at the consistency of those ratings over time. And construct validity, my dog doesn't have much to do with the job, right? Aim two is to determine VFA responsiveness to change. The hypothesis is simple. We think that it is responsive to change over time. And three is to evaluate clinical utility. The hypothesis is that the VFA will be easy to use, informative, worth the time and effort, and again, responsive. I know I'm running a little bit long here, so I'm going to cut out now because I think you have a view of the specific aims and then invite the reviewers.
All right, so reviewers, when you review the table and the microphone should turn on and off for review. That's something that's fine.
Was on. This process is not for the faint-hearted, for those of you who would like to get up and leave right now.
And he's absolutely telling the truth. My name is Kalia Johnson. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia. And I actually only have 5 days left of my postdoc, so I guess I can also introduce myself as assistant professor in the Division of Occupational Science and Occupational Therapy at University of North Carolina School of Medicine. This is an exciting opportunity for me to participate as a reviewer on Andy's grant because I am seeing that I don't know if it's a light at the end of the tunnel or exactly what it is, but or a moving train or something. But anyway, it's coming. So as reviewer one, I've been tasked with summarizing the grant and also providing a critique. So I'm going to give you another quick overview and then my thoughts on what's been submitted. So the submitted R01 entitled Vocational Fit Assessment and Employment Status in People with Intellectual Disabilities is a multi-site, multidisciplinary, mixed methods project designed to evaluate the reliability, validity, responsiveness, and clinical utility of the vocational fit assessment in a sample of adolescents and young adults with ID. The vocational fit assessment, or VFA, measures job demands and worker abilities that inform employment selection, as well as supports and related interventions in job settings. The VFA has been piloted multiple times and is also used by Project Search. As we've heard, the long-term goal of the proposed project is to improve employment outcomes for people with intellectual disabilities, and to achieve this goal, the investigators have outlined the following objectives and specific aims. And that's one, to quantify the reliability and validity in the context of people with ID in transition to employment. Two, to determine its responsiveness, and then thirdly, to evaluate its clinical utility. The investigators propose that by achieving these aims, the VFA will be a valuable tool for special education and vocational rehabilitation transition teams to evaluate improvement in employment outcomes, to match people with ID to appropriate jobs much earlier and provide increased time for development and practice of critical job skills, and to potentially reduce costs to support people with ID. So we'll start with the significance. People with intellectual disabilities are grossly unemployed and underemployed, and this study's significance lies in its attempt to address deficiencies in employment service system for adolescents and young adults with ID by refining a systematic job matching specifically for this population. The study is innovative in that the BFA is the only measure of employment status that is capable of systematic assessment of both work abilities and job demands for people with ID. It's web-based and free, making it accessible for consumers across various settings. And investigators have noted that its reach is considerable and an opportunity to accelerate translation to practice. And I would also add accelerate its translation to industry. The one thing to note, that although justification on how the BFA is superior to other employment-related assessments was provided, the investigators have not made clear how the BFA may be utilized in clinical trials as suggested. Pertaining to the investigators, they are experienced researchers and clinicians with demonstrated expertise in intellectual disability, transition, employment, and a number of sophisticated statistical modalities that I am very impressed by, to fulfill the aims of the project. Pertaining to the approach, overall, data collection and analytical processes outlined in the specific aims are appropriate for the project. However, I do have a question about the qualitative methods used in aim 3 specifically that require additional clarification. The investigators plan to employ strategies using both phenomenology and grounded theory, but to maintain the integrity of these approaches, I think some consideration should be given to how these distinct approaches are integrated to address either participants' experiences or processes for completing the assessment to determine employment fit, just as examples. And concerning the heterogeneity in the sample, the inclusion criteria primarily includes those with mild to moderate intellectual disability. So I would like for you all to address what procedures are in place to ensure individuals who can participate in employment activities who may not classify as mild or moderate will also be included. And to also clarify if part of that is Dr. Cleary's role in the project since he's in charge of recruitment. Pertaining to the environment, the investigators have switched institutions since the initial application. Details were provided on Dr. Persch's institution, specifically that he has access to more resources. And I just would like some more information on if that's the case for Drs. Kramer and Cleary as well, specifically on how the chains of institution have increased their access to better or just more resources. Pertaining to partnerships, it is unclear what additional community partnerships have been forged beyond special education, vocational rehab, and project search. Are the investigators collaborating with other community agencies and or employers of adolescents and young adults with ID? And if so, what role do they play in the development of your protocol and procedures, recruitment, analyses, and other scholarly products from the grants? And I wanted to end with the overall impact because I really have enjoyed reading your grant. It's well written and critically important study, not just for ID, but also special education, transition, and employment, with implications that reach into many other areas of practice, OT and beyond, plus industry. And as a community of scholars, I think we've admired the issues of employment in this population for a very long time. And so if successfully completed, I think this study will offer a comprehensive tool to better match individuals based on their interests and ability. And improving this will not only, of course, improve their employment experiences, but their economic situations and ultimately their quality of life. So thank you for allowing me to review this important work.
Okay, thanks. Can I have some side note? Can I have a side note here? No. So, I'm going to also mention issues of how a reviewer looks at a grant, what goes on in their head. Actually, again, back to Gary Kilhoff, he said more wise things. People give money to people. So when you're going for a granting agency, it's people that are giving you that money. So get to know those people. And the same thing with reviewing a grant. People review a grant, so you gotta know or anticipate the people that are gonna read the grant. So, you know, those of us that do this stuff or do research, we each have our area of expertise. So, Andy, you know where I'm coming from on this grant, right? You know? So, you know, obviously, and you're gonna certainly from from that person's expertise, that's where you're gonna make those statements. So either you hope that you have somebody that has measurement expertise, or you hope somebody doesn't have measurement expertise. You agree. Now then it gets to be points, because we're always, we're always reviewing grants where areas that you don't know about. So you do one of two things. Sometimes you look things up as a reviewer if you have a little bit of time, or you blow them off because you can't comment on them, because you feel silly to comment on them because you're not an expert on them. Or you say, what feel do I get when I start reading the stuff that maybe I don't understand? What's the investigator, trying to do here? What's her or his motive? So, I'm going to go over the a couple of areas. I'm going to try not to repeat things. Understudied group. So in the area of significance, understudied group, worthwhile. Puts in a long-term goal to improve employment. The grant doesn't address that. And for those of us who do measurements, we'd always love to say that our measurements will improve people, but they're measures, right? So that's a really long-term goal, and that really needs an intervention study or something like that. So it might be a little broad to say that that's what it's going to do. It's really a measurement study. The instrument's already developed. There's been some, and this quantifying reliability, validity, responsiveness, clinical utility. Investigators, I didn't have the whole packet, so all I know is Andy, and I didn't have the bio sketches, so I couldn't comment on that. The innovation, I think a reasonable argument for innovation. You put a table in that has a few other assessments that deal with individuals with intellectual disabilities. I kind of think that's a limited group of assessments to look at. There's actually broader assessments of vocational rehab that you can say, well, but relative to that particular disability, there's very few. So you're right about that, but maybe some of these others might work. Again, a dangerous thing to do is to have a reviewer that knows a little bit about something, but not a lot, and happen to know a little bit about something here. So there's a database called ONET, the Occupational Informational Network System. And so we, in a silly way, we dabbled doing some research on that. And there's actually in that data set, it's all the jobs are listed, and there's actually a data point called data value, and it reflects the job demand, and it ranks the demand of virtually almost every job you can think of. At some level that you're doing that also. I do see the point that you're doing it relative to a specific job that you're addressing with the person, so I can see, but you might have given a little bit more nod to that to say, and give some rationale of why your instrument would be better than this database. Okay, so the approach, and this is where I sort of address a lot of issues. I'm a measurement guy. I need to know about the instrument. I didn't know the instrument. I didn't know how many items were on the instrument. You now tell me there's 100 items on the instrument. 100 items on the instrument. And you say that this is going to take 2 hours to assess somebody, and you have other assessments that go on. Does the person get 100 items? Does you get other assessments? To me, then that would be a thing as a reviewer. I say, well, it's hard for me to believe that you're going to be able to do this assessment in 2 hours. So then I go, okay, so you got 100 items. I go, I didn't know that. I just learned that now. I go, how many constructs do you have? So how many subscales are there? I kind of figured out from my table, I think that are there 7 subscales there?
There are 10.
There's 10. So I've lost 3 of them someplace. So those, I think those really needed to be spelled out, in terms of the subscales and what items were under each subscale. Now, the issue is who does the ratings. You say reliable reporters, okay? And it can be the person with an intellectual disability, the parents, caregivers, teachers, job coaches, employers, family members, and or friends. Hard to believe. Hard to believe they could all be reliable. I mean, you know, I created an assessment for traumatic brain injury, and I had individuals with traumatic brain injury evaluating themselves. It was like, wow, it's kind of almost sort of a silly thing. It's like, isn't that kind of a critical flaw? So you have people with intellectual disabilities, and you say that they are going to evaluate themselves. You know, I mean, it's almost sort of, on the surface, it's a problem. Actually, it's kind of an irony, but when we did this with TBI, the individuals who assessed themselves did very, very well, you know, but I think most people would say, well, we're gonna have them assess themselves, and, you know, and how is everybody gonna know about the person or the job? Don't you have to know a certain amount about the person to know that? So how does a person become reliable? And so I would be hard pressed to believe that all of the people could be reliable. So that, I know you ought to say that. Okay. Sample wasn't described, and not in the database that I had. I don't know what the sample is. It's individuals with intellectual disability. I have to say what disability, how many, in each category. Does it matter? Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe intellectual disabilities is intellectual disabilities, but then you'd have to make an argument for that, to say that different intellectual disabilities would behave the same. So now I start getting into the area where that's beyond me, which is the analysis, okay? So I look at the analysis, and a lot of the analysis I don't understand, so I look up some of it. And, you know, I work in this area, so I know some of these analyses. But I counted 7 statistical analyses for inter-rater reliability. 7 analyses for inter-rater reliability. You do a clinical trial, there's really one critical analysis that you do. How can you have 7? And if you're going to have 7, when are you going to say it's reliable? When 6 of them are reliable? When 1 is? When 3 are? You know, so why do you need 7? So you see, now and then we get to the area I don't understand it. So now I get the impression, and this is where, you know, people review people. I go, Andy's trying to pull the wool over my eyes. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm thinking as I'm reading it. He is just loading this thing with analysis, trying to impress me, and he's got his biostatistician doing this. I'm getting a little annoyed. Okay, and you don't want a reviewer to be annoyed. I mean, again, it's people reviewing people, and don't annoy people, you know? So, you don't want to annoy a reviewer, because then the thing is, no grant has to be perfect, you know? And really, at times, if the grant flows, and you like it, and it's innovative, a few little things that go on, as a reviewer, you blow up. You go, you know what? Yeah, they kind of messed up. Like, I'll say that, you know, he says Cronbach's alpha is a measure of internal validity. I know the statistics on that, or technically isn't. So I get on him for that case. That's nothing. It's a really good grant. So, then the last area that I want to speak on is responsiveness. So, everybody who does instruments, responsiveness is the issue. Well, with responsiveness, you're going to expect change. So, what's the intervention? I don't know what the intervention is. All I have is companies named. Is it an aggressive intervention? Is it not an aggressive intervention? How much do these individuals really change, right? So, even though everybody knows that with an assessment you want responsiveness, but when you go with certain kinds of diagnostic groups that maybe don't change a lot, really well. And you know, then you're covering these people for, I finally found the time points. Baseline, 12 months, and 24 months. We're gonna be covering people for 2 years, and you're telling me that you're gonna have a 20% dropout rate. Not convinced. That's a long time to carry people out, so. That's it.
I will make also follow your lead in terms of making one side comment. I think one of the things this review plays out in some ways is how challenging it is to get a mixed methods review through a committee, because you have people that will focus on their area of expertise, and others, including the first reviewer and myself probably, will focus on one of the other approaches, such as the qualitative approach. So I think mixed methods have their own special set of challenges in that way. I also would like to begin just by thanking Dr. Persch for letting us do this. Hopefully it's helpful. And I won't duplicate comments, or try not to, that either the first or second reviewer has said, but I concur with a number of their comments. I think there are some additional strengths. I think the application makes a strong case for what a huge problem this is. We all know that employment outcomes for people with intellectual disability is just unacceptable. And it's a tenacious problem that's been that way for a long time. So I think the weight of the problem, I think, was definitely a strength of this proposal in attempting to impact on that. For me, my perception of impact was a little bit diminished by really questioning the degree to which the results will ultimately impact on the problem. I like the idea that it will, and there are a lot of strengths in this proposal around matching. And also personalizing, really trying to get at the, as you mentioned, the real world, real life circumstances of individual, and matching that particular person to that particular job. I think those are both innovations and strengths that I think are important. But it was hard for me to reconcile the fact that I didn't really know, I couldn't have a sort of real solid commitment that this would really change employment circumstances for individuals. I also was a little concerned in the approach about some issues related to rigor and conceptualization, as well as some pragmatics of the data collection, so I'll probably focus my final comments on that. I did, in terms of investigators, have a comment. It was unclear from the materials we had the extent to which there was qualitative research or expertise involved in either the design or the implementation. So if that's not there, it would be a recommendation to think about that. As I mentioned, in terms of the approach, it appeared that a lot of your focus was on integrating the qualitative and quantitative aspects of the data that you were collecting. And I wanted to recommend a conversion to thinking about how can you maximize on the initially separate contributions about qualitative and quantitative might have. It felt like the effort to integrate, you might actually be missing some opportunities to draw more particularly on the qualitative data and use in a different way. It was somewhat hard for me to evaluate the rigor related to particularly the survey and the qualitative aspects that you mentioned, like focus groups, because in this version, the pragmatics of how you are going to do that. And also in terms of the survey itself, the details around any pre-testing or piloting or any kind of rigorous development of individual items was not apparent to the reviewer. It was also unclear to me the extent to which you were going to be gathering and analyzing intervention history information. I think it relates to reviewer two's point, that 2 years is a long time, and for me, the conceptualization of the assessment to the behavioral changes that you were referring to was hard to make that connection without there being some kind of model or explicit conceptualization of how the assessment tool itself would influence the kinds of behavioral interventions that could happen in the clinical kinds of settings. You mentioned as part of your surveying that you'll be adding some narrative questions into what appeared to be primarily a closed question survey technique, and I think that's particularly challenging. And I think from a survey perspective, would want to have more convincing evidence of how you are monitoring those kind of response shifts of people from going to closed-ended questions to expecting kind of narrative responses and then wanting to interpret those using narrative kinds of analysis. Just a couple of other things. You project a 40% response rate for your survey. That seemed low. It may be realistic, but it seemed low. So as a reviewer, I would have liked to have seen more effort into how can I up that response rate, or these procedures will be implemented to maximize the kind of response rate that we could get. I also thought the simulated scenarios that you were proposing sounded like a really intriguing idea, but I couldn't go further with it because it was unclear what those would actually be and the kinds of data and the kinds of analysis that that would lead to. You mentioned in your aim 3 that you're going to do a series of purposive sampling, and the word purposive in some ways is helpful, but in other ways it just left me with questions. So how are you going to continue to ratchet down the numbers for each phase of this aim that you're going to be doing? How will we know that the people you end up with in any way are representative of the large sample that you started with? The final question, which I think reviewer 1 mentioned, that I also thought was another missed opportunity, was thinking about, is there any way you can get the perspectives of the people with intellectual disability themselves about what they're experiencing in either the assessment process or over the course of these employment efforts? It would be great if their perspective and their perceptions could be part of your responsiveness analysis. So thank you.
I think that Andy is still standing. I asked him a second ago if he was okay, and he assured me he was. So at this point, let me just summarize what the reviewers have said. So from the significance standpoint, everyone agrees that this is addressing a weighty problem. It's very significant. This is a huge problem that we have that definitely needs to be addressed. The overall idea of creating an instrument to address long-term employment is important, and yet it may be unclear exactly how this study itself will address long-term employment in the long term. With regards to innovation, there's a lot of excitement about the ideas of matching personability to the demands of the task, but there are some questions about how this assessment specifically is addressing that with regards to being distinctive in the field. How is this assessment different from perhaps other assessments that already exist? The excitement for the approach is slightly diminished in several different areas. There are some questions, or there's some requests from the reviewers to provide more details about the instrument, the ratings, the sample, and also about both the qualitative and quantitative analyses, and specifically the criteria used for interpretation. There are some, the reviewers are unclear with regards to how the scenarios may play out, and also there's some requests to include perspectives of the sample. But overall, the reviewers believe that the impact can be great, but there are some questions about the approach that dampen the enthusiasm.
All right, so I'm actually going to come sit by my colleagues because I don't know. And I really appreciate the feedback. It's very helpful and rings true with things I've heard. I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh. All right, I was just thanking the reviewers for their comments. Is this okay? So I'm just putting up for a second. We don't need to blind ourselves. This is an overview of the research team, and then also the project advisory committee for the grant. And so just to orient you to how we're doing this grant, there are 3 data collection sites: Colorado State University. I'm working with Patty Davies, James Graham, and a biostatistician, Julia Sharp. Beth Pfeiffer at Temple University is running data collection as well, and then Jessica Kramer at the University of Florida. And then I also have my research partner, Dennis Cleary, who's at Indiana University in South Bend, and our project search collaborators who are at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center. Of course, we're working with students in all of these sites. And then we wrapped our research team with a project advisory committee that includes people with intellectual disabilities themselves, parents, caregivers, representatives from the different populations from which we're sampling, so vocational rehabilitation, special education, project search, and then also having national experts on that panel as well. And so one of the first responses I'll make is that part of the design of the project advisory committee is to check our surveys and our data collection methods and our open-ended question, closed-ended question tools with this advisory committee before it ever goes out. And so that is an element of it. So I think I just have to jump in here. So comments around how we use vocational fit assessment as an outcome measure. And that absolutely is a fair comment, and it's feedback that I've received quite often. And so as a clinician, the traditional measures of employment status just don't provide me with enough information to make clinical decisions. And so the idea with VoCFit is that by having different subscales and by looking at different constructs, we can start to parse out elements of employment that are not necessarily apparent in those criterion measures. We built this tool in the context of the Project Search model. Project Search is a high school transition program for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Their special sauce is collaboration. So they get school districts to provide a special educator. State VR and DE provides job coaches and money for job coaches. Employers provide a place of employment in which they can train. And so Project Search interns during this year rotate through 3 different job training activities. And so we built the tool explicitly to be able to inform those job placement decisions, right? Which, if we're looking to build skills in this area or that area, which jobs would target those skills? And then as we complete one internship, the idea is to see, did we move the needle on the construct that we were focusing on, and then inform the next job placement decision. So it's not a perfect answer, I don't think, but that is the conceptualization of how we think this could be used as an outcome measure. I think another one of the key comments is about
It's to the right. There's a panel on the right, Jenny. There's a panel on the right to the of the computer. Oh, here, hold that.
Yeah, so use as an outcome measure. You know, I think a larger question is this going to be responsive in a much larger population? And then the intervention question. That is feedback that I've gotten a lot. Is this about assessment, or is this about employment support intervention, and what's going to move the needle on employment outcomes? And so strategically, I had to go one way or the other. And so we named it vocational fit assessment, and I decided to frame it in that light. And so I hope that we'll be able to continue to see VoCFit as useful for Project Search, but then potentially also in a larger general specialized population that's not getting a specific intervention. They're a person in transition to employment.
And you had a pragmatic question in terms of how it operates. So obviously it has to be, because you can have a measure of a work situation and a measure of the person. So the way that this rehabilitation happens, are they already that kind of matched by the professional?
An IEP team, a transition
Right,
planning team,
so
a
that's,
VR team.
so that's going to be the core of how you would end up doing that measure. So based on
Yes.
that placement. Oh, I'm sorry. So based on that placement, then the decision gets made. Then it's like, okay, now we can implement the assessment, right? Because obviously it has to be relative to the job.
Yes.
So if I put the person in an easy job, they could do well, and the scores on this are going to be one way. If they put them in a job that's over their head, it's going to be another. So the idea that it intrinsically, and that's the way it should be, right? Intrinsically, the person's going to be placed in something that is most likely relative, Dr. Woodbury would say a just right challenge, you know, for the person. So, okay, so that gives us the framework of how, you know, that it would be used, and that makes a lot of sense.
I think I'm gonna try to pick what feel like the meat and potatoes issues here. So a number of comments around the population sample itself. As many of you will know, intellectual disability is quite a broad range of capacities and interests, and so a number of our grants, we've looked at all different kind of parts of that intellectual disability of that population, and the feedback is you have to focus down on just one thing. And so the original submission of this grant included a third aim that proposed to extend the VFA to the population of those that had severe and profound disabilities, and that got blown out of the water. Like, really terribly negative feedback. This is way too much, and they're right. And so with the resubmission, we decided that given that we built this in the project search model, given that that model is targeted at the higher functioning end of the population, we decided we had to define it as mild to moderate. A kind of secondary, not secondary, I think one of the key inclusion criteria for our samples across project search, special ed, and or rehab is that the person with an intellectual disability needs to be their own guardian. And so that even constricts the population in the sample that we're looking at even more. And I don't feel great about that because I really do want to move the needle for the whole group. But to make this competitive, I just had to pull it in. I think I could address a couple things in the context of a change of institution. Kalia, you had questions around community partners. And so fortunately, we did not have to do new letters of support as part of the transfer application. So all of our letters of support are now 20 months old. And they were Ohio State and Boston University and Temple. And so we're building those partnerships. I'm very fortunate at Colorado State to be partnered up with James Graham, who's the new director of the Center for Community Partnerships. And that center has been doing this type of work for 30 years. And so maybe I'm being naive, but I don't have any concerns about having really great partners across all of our sites. So I think I'm going to shift a little bit to Craig at this point. Grant does not address the employment outcome. You're absolutely right, and that is a diffuse, broad, long-term goal. The next thing is, what do employment trajectories look like when we make our decisions based on these data, right? And does that actually change? So I don't necessarily think it's the assessment that changes anything. It's what you do with these data. We make a good job match, and we identify the areas that we need to intervene. I appreciate the comment about needing to think about other assessments outside of the population. We built this by looking at a broader world, and it's a good idea to come back and ground it in that.
I think your argument's fine. You know what I mean? It would be just that, so to shore up that argument, since it's such a specific population, I think you've got it nailed, but it's just the idea that you could be broader.
Craig made a comment about ONET, the Occupational Information Network, and he is absolutely right that ONET has more information about jobs than any of us really could ever want. And ONET will give you a single score, right, for a job, right? Kind of a job. What was the variable?
Actually, there's sub-scores for like all of these subsets of on the instrument, on certain kinds of demands and stuff like that, they get rated, there's a rating for all of these jobs. The news is it's out there. The other news is vocation people hate it. It's a dinosaur that's out there that when you do bring up that I'm going to use it, they go, oh no, we're going to redo the whole thing. So it's kind of there, but it may not be up to date for what you want.
So person or job scores are absolutely underlying the VFA assessments. One of the things that Dennis and I encountered early on when we were presenting this was that if we were trying to characterize a person with a disability using, say, just a number, as opposed to showing you a graphic that has greens and yellows and reds, we were losing people very quickly. And we got very strong negative feedback that you do not want to be characterizing a person with a single, say, ability score. And so we shifted the focus to that kind of comparison of what the job demands and then what the person is able to do. An astute observation, we have quite an assessment battery, and I'm concerned as well about how we're going to so one of the things we know about this group is that we can get better data if we give them more processing time. And so part of the data collection strategy, and maybe I'll take one step back and just address reliable reporting. So we're proposing to collect data on the person with the intellectual disability from a dyad, a person with intellectual disability, and then their reliable reporter. And as Craig said, we define that very, very broadly. And I think by inclusion criteria is that if you've known or worked with this person for a year or more, then you could fill out this assessment. So that's just a line in the sand, and we had to try to do that. So as conceptualized, we are planning to send the dyad, the assessment battery, a week ahead of time, so that they can review it on their own time and at their own pace. We would then schedule a 1 hour in-person or Zoom interview to collect those data from it. So we're compensating them for 2 hours of time. It may be that it takes more time to actually, for them to prepare and then for us to collect the data from them. Absolutely right. I'm a little bit embarrassed. There's pretty meager details about what this tool actually is in the grant. And I think maybe that's just a reflection of needing to fit this science into different formats, whether it be NIH or NIDLR or IES, and running out of space, or if I want to put this table here, I'm going to need to cut a paragraph there. And so you're absolutely right. I think I rely too much on just saying, go look at this one article. So.
I'm too lazy.
I did throw the kitchen sink at the analyses, but not to try to pull wool over your eyes. I don't think I could pull that off. But in my brain, the things like the internal consistency analyses, those are not the meat and potatoes of what this is. And so the larger, the primary analyses, it's just one thing. There are a series of linked analyses, but you're absolutely right that that's a little bit overkill to say that we're going to do Cronbach's alpha and ordinal alpha and Krippendorf's. That's fair.
I have to have my biostatistician on speed dial.
The 20% attrition rate, and I can't remember exactly if it was 20% at each point or if it was 20% across the 2 years. But that's absolutely something that is on the top of my mind. One of the major major changes between the original submission and this one is we went from 7 data collection points, so every 6 months over 3 years, to every 12 months over 2 years. And so that dramatically simplified. And so maybe they weren't as concerned about the 20% because I eliminated half.
Blew them away with the
Yeah.
first one, again. Oh, that's more reasonable.
One of the things that, so now I'm shifting to Mary, and I'll try to wrap up here so we can take some questions. One of the things, and it's a nice connection, one of the things that Craig said to me at Tiger, and it relates to Mary's comment about, what impact is this gonna actually have on the problem. Craig, he says, visualize this big variance pie of employment outcomes, right? So, in the whole world, if we want to move employment outcomes, there are things that go into that. How much of that is going to be assessment? And it's probably a pretty small fraction of that employment outcome variance, right? And that's a fair criticism, and it's what we're hoping to show here, that maybe it's a little bit more, maybe if we do a good job of it, it can move the needle. Probably related to qualitative, some of the qualitative comments, putting phenomenology and grounded theory and analyses next to each other in the same sentence is a little bit tricky. And so I will absolutely be looking to my collaborators, Jessica and Beth, who have much more qualitative experience than I do, to help guide me through those processes. I do appreciate the comment on maximizing the individual analyses as a primary activity. Whereas I think what I was trying to sell the integration of these mixed method studies.
And you got funded, so maybe that was a
Yeah.
good strategy. But I think you now have an opportunity to also maximize that.
We will have a little bit of descriptive data on treatment history. So what the folks in the regular special ed sample and the vocational rehab sample, what they're doing, but it's not gonna be it's not gonna address the point. It'll be pretty, I think, superficial level things. But I think it's important to take a step back and try to describe what those things look like. One of the criticisms of the original application was that it was project search only, and that this would not generalize. And so we expanded it, and so now we need to see how we're working in that setting. I would have loved to include simulated scenario details. I think that study is actually really cool. We're asking clinicians, teachers to consider VFA data. The job has a high demand, the person has a high ability. Based on that alone, would you support or oppose the job match? And then we're comparing what our experts say to what our what that matching algorithm actually does. And so it is fun, and I wish I could have had a little bit more detail in there. And then I guess finally, your last comment, Mary, needing to emphasize and capture perspectives of people with intellectual disabilities more explicitly. As you said that, I realized that I had that group on my advisory committee, and that maybe I checked that box and moved on, right? But there's absolutely so much more to be gleaned from that collaboration and work together. So maybe at this time we shift.
So a couple of things that we can do here, so any feedback that you have or questions that you have. And then also, Andy, what I want you to maybe address at some point is, the fact is that this grant is funded. And so, thank you for the comments, but hey, I got my money and I'm like,
we have to jump on every single thing we can think of, because those panelists around the table are not us. And we have to figure out how they're thinking, because as Craig says, it's a person that they're thinking about giving the money to. And they're not going to be occupational therapists around the table. In fact, we'll be lucky if there's one. If there's two, it'd be like, what, amazing. And so you have to speak to a whole other group of people. And so you have to imagine what every single critical thing that they're going to say. And so, moreover, that you only have 12 pages to do it. I don't know if you know the context of this, is you only have 12 pages. So Craig wanted details and details and details, and I could just see Andy's going, yeah, well, we thought about that, we thought about that, and we have to decide what goes in and what doesn't go in. But Craig will be around the table, and so you have to predict if it's going to happen. So, anyways, thank you for doing that. But I want to make one other comment, and this is where I step up above sort of this piece, because some of you are NIH reviewers, and some of you are going to be NIH reviewers, and we want you to be NIH reviewers. There's a responsibility you have to be an NIH reviewer, and that is you want to really look at the science and be very critical and really look, because we want to convey the scientific review so they're making the best decisions, they're making the best awards, right? That's a responsibility. It took me about half a dozen times to realize that around the table, I might have been the only one representing the area that understood what was going on. There's another responsibility. And so I'm going to sort of say somebody has to be able to, around the table, talk to Craig, who's making those comments. And so we have a responsibility to say, yeah, the alpha coefficient, whether it's internal consistency or internal validity thing, they have to be able to poo-poo it. And we have to sit around and say, this proposal is so significant and so innovative that this is going to be a breakthrough, and those outcomes, it really has a chance at those long-term outcomes. And so now what am I doing? I'm saying somebody actually has to be a proponent for the proposals and the applications in our field, because the other 19 people around the table won't do that. And so besides just being a really good scientific critique, we have a responsibility of representing our areas that we know best, because there may be five biomechanists around the table that are looking at that and they're going, where's the outcomes, where's the quantitative, whatever. And somebody has to say, well, yeah, that may be true, but this is really, really significant in our field. So anyway, that was just my comment around it. Thank you.
Echo what Roger said in terms of thank you very much, and thank you for being brave, Andy. That's awesome. Regarding the thing about people giving money to people, when you do an NIH scientific peer review, you can't even mention funding as a peer reviewer. You're not allowed to talk about funding. As a peer reviewer, your sole job is to evaluate the rigor of the science and the merit of the science. I have been part of scientific peer review committees where the scientific program administrator would say, as well as the chair, no talk about the F word. And that's not the nasty F word, that's the funding. So no talk about that throughout this entire, that was a ground rule throughout this entire meeting, because it's not the job of the peer reviewers to make any decisions about funding. The job of the peer reviewers at the NIH level is to talk about the merit and the rigor of the grant. Now that changes potentially at a foundation level or at some of the other levels, but at NIH that's very clear.
Thank you, Shirley. I'll just make one comment. So we had to do the transfer application this year, and given that this had gone through study section, the number one priority was do not change the science, because we didn't want to raise any red flags for that administrative review. Liz?
Hi, I'm Liz Schmidt. I'm a PhD candidate. Sorry.
We'll go Liz first and then Susie.
Sorry. Liz Schmidt, PhD candidate at Ohio State University. Since there's quite a few of us young scientists, future scientists in the room, I was wondering if you could spend a little bit of time talking about how you try to highlight your experiences and expertise. I feel like a lot of times I hear people getting feedback about who really has the expertise to do these certain things, and kind of how you build your team to help support that, and just any advice you have for all of us that are just getting started.
Sure. So I think I'll speak to team first. It's engaging with the community of scholars, connecting with them at events like this. And so my relationships with Jessica and Beth came from participation at the OT Summit. And then those folks willing to give up themselves, right, to my research program, and help me improve my research program over time. I think that is a key driver. And also then learning from them as a junior contributor on their grant applications. Related to how I was presenting my expertise, as someone on the tenure track in an assistant professor position, I had not been a PI on a grant of this level, but I had been co-PI, the Department of Ed grant. I was fortunate to be co-PI. And so what I tried to do was highlight how those experiences have prepared me to do this next thing. And so, you know, the reviewer, I didn't share my bio sketch with the reviewers, but that whole first paragraph is really talking, and it's weird for an OT to talk about themselves, but it really is about all the different projects that I've done in pediatrics or transition, and at local, state, national levels, to just try to convey that I've done a number of things, and that I think I'm prepared to do this. And I'll share, that still is a criticism of our team, is that we're all new investigators. That's something we tried to address after the original submission by publishing an article or two together, presenting, fixing those gaps.
Thank you.
And if I could also add to your comment about how you sort of fixed that gap in your second submission, was also to highlight the fact that your scholarly products are all concentrated in the area that you have proposed your research in. So although it may be fairly recent, it all related, and that's kind of important to highlight as well.
Yeah, so I'll echo that. I think the message is focus. Whatever your thing is, you need to, on the tenure track, you need to be very focused on that thing. And so a lot of those grants that were submitted and not funded, they were disparate things. And so I probably spun my wheels a little bit, because it's difficult to triangulate loan repayment feedback, or lack thereof, with a NIDLR grant fee, right? So I feel like I was able to get momentum once I really started to focus my work in.
We have time for one more comment.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I think it's small steps and a supportive environment. So I trained with Jane K. Smith at Ohio State. Right, the first manuscript that I got back from her was all red. The whole thing was red. And that wasn't her, if you sat down with her, you would never have expected that, I don't think. Just kind of her personality. And so really from my very first semester of my PhD, it was a culture of valuing critical, constructive feedback, because the people that are investing that time in you are doing it because they care. And so even now, like, this is not a comfortable thing to do. I feel like I sweat out a whole swimming pool. But so yes, the grant's funded, but all I've done is cut the budget by 15%. So I have 5 years of work to do now. And so as I embark on this first big grant of my career, how incredible is it that I can have folks who actually do know a little bit about my stuff to give me this level of feedback. You know, there's at least a dozen potential pitfalls now that we have on our radar. And so I'm so grateful for the experience. So yeah, I think it's training environment as well. So we're a multidisciplinary training environment, you know, PT and athletic training and dietitians and all the other health professions in the College of Medicine. And to see how those other professions socialize their young scientists. I've felt much more under pressure in front of PT audiences. And so maybe it's having a little bit of experience talking about these things in front of those folks who aren't as nice as my friends. My mom's a PT. She's lovely though.